the honor of introducing our special guest speaker, who is a friendly name to some of you, and after this will be to all of you. So he is a director of the Wellbeing Government initiative at the Centre for Policy Development, and he's also a co-founder of the Castlemaine Institute. He's also an economist, ecologist, and a herpetologist. So I recommend you guys looking that up. So please give a hand and warmly welcome Warwick Smith, who will be speaking today.
Thanks, Esther. I know that some of you have actually heard this talk already from the Wellbeing Conference, and sorry about that. Feels a bit unusual to give the same talk to some of the same people, but hope you still enjoy it, and I hope I'll add a few different twists. I don't know what everyone else can see, but I can see a slide of myself instead of, oh yeah, good one. Don't need that slide sitting there the whole time I'm talking. So as Esther said, I'm going to talk about why we might want a wellbeing economy. And in order to do that, I'll sort of talk briefly about what I think a wellbeing economy is and tell a bit of a story about past economic paradigm shifts, as well as contrasting a wellbeing economy with our current economy here in Australia. I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the Jara people from whose unceded lands I'm speaking today here in Central Victoria. A wellbeing economy is fundamentally dependent on healthy country and also on relationship to country. And obviously there are no better teachers for this than those whose people have lived here for countless generations. This is one of the reasons why First Nations perspectives have to be central to wellbeing economy, and why caring for country is also critical to any conception of wellbeing economy. I want to acknowledge local senior elder Uncle Rick Nelson, other local elders, and the sort of countless past elders that have been part of Jara country. So the most popular phrase for a wellbeing economy is an economy that works for people and planet, which, that sounds pretty good, right? Who could argue with an economy that works for people and planet? But the trick comes in the detail. What does that actually mean, an economy that works for people and planet? And what would it look like if we had one? How would it be different from today's economy? Earlier this year, Catherine Trebek and I published this little explainer, the wellbeing economy in brief, outlining what we mean when we say wellbeing economy. Check it out for a more in-depth sort of description of wellbeing economy than I have time for here. But the core principles of wellbeing economy are pretty straightforward, I think, at least on the surface. And Catherine has coined these as the 4 Ps. So many of you have heard Catherine talk about this before, and I'll just be super brief talking about them now. But the first P is purpose. The economy should be guided by our values. This is well captured by something that Australian Treasurer Jim Chalmers said when discussing Measure What Matters, the National Wellbeing Framework. To build the kind of economy that we want, we've got to align what we want to see in our economy with what we want to see in our society and in our communities. The second P is people-powered, which sounds like 2 Ps, but it's only one. Don't count the second one. People-powered essentially means democratic, but not the kind of, turn up and vote once every 3 or 4 years democratic, but, that people are well informed, they're involved in key decisions, including sort of industrial democracy and political and economic democracy. The next P is preventative. This means that we act to prevent problems from occurring rather than only seeking to address them after they arise. By necessity, this also means sort of long-term thinking, planning, and budgeting. The last P is pre-distribution. So we're all familiar with redistribution. We tax those with the means to pay, and then we redistribute, either through direct monetary transfers or through the provision of services to those in need. Pre-distribution is about creating an economy that works for people up front, so that less redistribution is actually necessary. It means that good work is available to all who want it, and all jobs are well enough paid to live a good life and to fully participate in society. So that's kind of a super quick, maybe superficial overview of the 4Ps. And I think on the surface, they're all pretty hard to argue with, but as I said before, the devil is really in the detail. So as I go on with this talk, I'll keep coming back to the 4Ps as a reference point. So maybe next we talk about to what extent we already have a wellbeing economy in Australia. How well does our economy match up with the 4Ps? So Australia is one of the richest countries in the world at the richest time in human history. I think it's a very interesting exercise to hold that thought while considering our current housing crisis, the cost of living pressures, increasing homelessness, a youth mental health epidemic, slowly degrading public health and education systems, worsening Indigenous disadvantage, and ongoing biodiversity loss and extinction. One of the richest countries in the world at the richest time in human history. None of the above things are inevitable or simply the cost we pay for progress, nor are they necessary trade-offs in order to have an efficient market economy, as some apologists may try to tell you. Not many economists will admit this. In fact, I think many economists don't even know it. But economics is a social science. And as such, the economy is a social construct. This not only means that there are no immutable laws of economics like there are laws of physics, but it also means that we can decide whether or not we have a world-class health and education system and whether or not we conserve our unique biodiversity. Even more critically, it tells us that the problems we see in our current society are the result of deliberate decisions that could have been made differently and can still be recast. I haven't talked yet about climate change, but maybe we'll just sort of briefly go there. Our current trajectory on climate change takes us somewhere between catastrophe and apocalypse, with catastrophe being the optimistic end of this spectrum. And it's hard to talk about, and I don't say that lightly or flippantly. I really think it's the truth. I don't know how many of you remember 350.org, which was an organization named after the atmospheric concentrations of CO2 below which we needed to stay to avoid harmful levels of global warming. We blew straight through that and are now at somewhere above 420 parts per million. Then we move to the Paris Agreement, attempting to keep warming below 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, because the science told us that this gave us a decent chance of avoiding the worst impacts of climate change. There's now almost no doubt that will also blow through the 1.5 degree threshold. We're already bumping uncomfortably up against it even this year. Will we get serious enough about climate change in time to keep it below 2 degrees? In this kind of unknown area between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming is a catastrophe of increased natural disasters, rising sea levels, crop failures, ecological collapses. The World Economic Forum has predicted more than 500,000 homes in Australia will be uninsurable by 2030. Many already are uninsurable for flooding. We're already struggling to keep up with the repairs from natural disasters at their current level. How this will look sort of by 2050, when these impacts are much worse and insurance is unaffordable or unavailable to many, is anyone's guess. As I said earlier, I live in Castlemaine on Jara country in central Victoria, and it's not a widely known fact, but school kids from Castlemaine started the school strike for climate movement in Australia, sort of taking the lead from Greta Thunberg. And a while back, I spoke to one of these school students, exhausted from their efforts, and they asked me, "What are the adults doing? What are we doing?" Despite many people doing amazing things, collectively, the reality is that us adults are failing. There's no doubt in my mind, really, that the world we're leaving behind is one that will be worse than the one we inherited. And we're not blindly walking into this future. We know it's coming, but we either feel sort of helpless to stop it, and so choose mostly not to think about it, or we're striving as hard as we can, but feel like we're sort of pushing with our bare hands against the tide. So, no wonder we have a youth mental health epidemic that we're also mostly not talking about. So, I hope I've reached the bottom of the hole in my talk, and I want to start climbing out, because, despite the way perhaps it sounds, given all the gloomy stuff that I've just said, I'm actually an optimist, and that's why I do the sort of work that I do. I really believe that we can create a better economy, and I very much doubt the thing that we create will be called the wellbeing economy, just like the current economy isn't called the neoliberal economy. It's just called the economy. But I do think we can use that term, wellbeing economy, to help to guide us to something different and something better than we have right now. So with that in mind, what can we do, and what might this wellbeing economy actually look like? I think we should start with action that combines the first two P's, which were purpose and people powered. We at CPD, along with a sort of coalition of other organisations, some of which are on the call, are currently advocating for a national conversation about the Australia that we want for ourselves and for future generations. Such a national conversation would involve many methods of engagement, from kitchen table conversations to town hall meetings to citizens' assemblies, online surveys and media coverage. And we'd ideally be reaching out to school children, people in aged care facilities, people with disabilities, and First Nations visions for the future would be central to such a conversation. And while we obviously don't know specifically what would emerge from such a conversation, we do know that when you engage deeply with people and go beyond the day-to-day concerns, some of the things that they sort of care most about are their relationships and the health of the environment and about equity. Even rich people are less happy in very unequal societies. So such a national conversation, if sort of conducted comprehensively and genuinely, could create a public mandate for political action. They held such a conversation in Wales. Many of you will have heard about that. And distilled out of this were 7 overarching wellbeing goals that were then embedded in the Welsh Future Generations Act, and also embedded into the actions and decision-making of all government bodies. They also created the world's first Future Generations Commissioner. Maybe in the discussion section of today, we can talk a bit more about Wales. But has this made Wales a sort of greatest place on earth and a fully fledged wellbeing economy? Of course not. It's only sort of 5 years in the making. But it has started them on a different path, and they're genuinely making different decisions about how they use their resources and how they shape their economy. And it has made their journey to a wellbeing economy much more likely. So here in Australia, we'd love to see such a national conversation inform future iterations of the National Wellbeing Framework, measuring what matters. And like they did in Wales, see that framework that emerges from the people and brings the principles and values of the people to be integrated into sort of government decision making and how the government allocates resources. If we in Australia took this sort of long-term future generation lens to policy making, we'd make very different decisions, I think. We would prioritise repairing our natural environment over short-term gains from selling off our natural resources as fast and as cheaply as possible. At the risk of too many digressions, I think it'd be good to talk about natural resources for a little while. Australia is blessed, and some might say cursed, with an abundance of numerous types of natural resources. This incredible natural wealth has made us, from an economic complexity perspective, really lazy. We've been able to be a rich country primarily just by growing things and digging things up and selling them overseas. There's another thing that we don't often talk about, and that's that the natural resources that lie beneath our soils and beneath our oceans belong to the Australian people. We allow companies to extract and sell them on our behalf, and then we treat the relatively meagre return we get as income. So two things about this are really important. One is that we call it income when it's actually an asset sale. Calling iron ore sales income is like selling your furniture and calling it income. The other important point is how little return we actually get for selling our assets. If we really treated natural resource extraction as the sale of assets that belong to the Australian people, we'd act very differently. One approach would be to contract out the extraction and processing of the resources and sell them ourselves. This is the approach taken by the Saudis with their oil, for instance. Another approach would be to sort of appropriately tax the super profits that these companies make. This is the approach Norway has taken with its oil wealth, leading it to build up the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. We don't do either of these things. Instead, we work as hard as we can to facilitate the fastest possible asset stripping at bargain basement rates. Many of our resource companies pay little or no company tax, despite being extraordinarily profitable. And the royalties we charge allow the companies, instead of the public who own the resources, to be the primary beneficiaries of resources booms. I did say I was done with the negative talk, didn't I? But again, part of the national conversation idea is to create an authorizing environment that allows politicians to stand up to corporate vested interests, like those in the resources sector. We want an economy that works for people and planet. But I would argue at the moment we have an economy that works for profit and rent extraction. The task for us, everyone involved in the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and beyond, is both to fully expose the disconnect between what the people want and what actually happens, and also to demonstrate that there are alternatives to the business as usual. So a national conversation gets us a long way towards that first P, purpose, and begins a different approach to democracy and people power. So what about the third P, prevention? This is where the discussion about the Australia we want for future generations really kicks in, I think. The current political system really struggles to think beyond 3 or 4 year election or budget cycles. But, we know from other areas that long-term planning is possible. We do it in defence. We do it with big infrastructure projects. So we know we can do it in health, education, and the environment. Almost everywhere you look, there are examples of preventative measures that are proven to be more cost-effective and to deliver better results. But with rare exceptions, we don't tend to resource them. It's very difficult for a politician to front the media and talk about all the hospital visits that haven't happened. It's a lot better to publicly stand in front of, shiny new ambulances or cut the ribbon at a new wing of a hospital. So, again, a sort of well-constructed national wellbeing framework that embeds these values and principles in the actions of government could provide politicians with the acknowledgement and the credit for preventative actions. The Victorian government's early intervention investment framework is a great example of a mechanism that looks longer term at how we can prevent problems from arising. We should be learning from that. We should be spreading it to other governments and encouraging it further upstream to sort of systemic causes of social and environmental problems such as poverty. Poverty brings us to the last P, which is not poverty. It's pre-distribution. Those of you who've seen Catherine speak about the 4 Ps, which is probably most of you, no doubt, agree that she does a better job of it than me. So pre-distribution. I think this is an opportunity to take another digression. Now, the kind of economic paradigm shift that we're talking about here, from an economy that works for rent and profit extraction to one that works for people and planet, has only happened twice in Australia in the last 100 years. Let's talk quickly about those other 2 transitions, because I think they're really instructive and will lead to a point about pre-distribution eventually. In Australia, in the closing years of World War II, the Curtin government began planning for the post-war economy. And the policymakers of the day, perhaps most important among them being H.C. Coombs, had lived through the Great Depression. And they'd seen the suffering and the waste of the Depression and 20% unemployment. And then they lived through World War II, where government expenditure effectively eliminated unemployment. And they asked themselves, if government expenditure can create full employment during the war, then why can't it during peacetime? And so with that question in mind, and their sort of imaginations set ablaze by the work of John Maynard Keynes, they wrote the 1945 White Paper on Full Employment, which is a really remarkable document, I think, that laid out the justification for government-created full employment and a plan for how to do it. And, they reasoned that if we embrace and want the benefits of market-based capitalism, then we should also acknowledge and address the costs. And one of the costs of a market-based system is unemployment that's caused by the business cycle. And because we're collectively embracing a system that causes unemployment, we should take collective responsibility for the unemployed. Imagine hearing a politician say that today. Instead, today, to combat inflation, we raise unemployment deliberately by raising interest rates. Then we blame the unemployed for not having a job. We keep them on unemployment benefits that are way below the poverty line and make them jump through sort of meaningless and degrading hoops that we call mutual obligations. Anyway, back to 1945. When the war ended, they put their plan into action. And for the next 25 years, unemployment in Australia averaged 2%. Material standards of living rose sharply and inequality was falling. This last point is really important, particularly for the point about pre-distribution. So full employment creates conditions that provide labour with a really strong bargaining position. And the result was an increasing proportion of Australia's economic output going to labour and a falling proportion going to capital or profits. So that last part is really critical to our story. inequality was falling. So this means the proportion of economic output going to the rich was falling. Well, the rich didn't like it, and they fought back. So from the moment Keynesian economic management came to dominate, there were already forces working to undermine it. The sort of full historical story is long and complicated, but the sort of TLDR version is that very wealthy business interests around the world bankrolled think tanks, lobbyists, university departments, and the media over decades to construct an alternative economic paradigm. They had a very explicit, laid out, quite public plan to build this alternative, create powerful champions for it, and then wait for a crisis into which they could leap as saviors. So, that crisis came eventually in the form of the OPEC oil shocks of the 1970s. And the neoliberals, as they used to call themselves, but no longer do, seized the moment and, over a couple of decades, brought an end to the Keynesian paradigm, ushering in the current paradigm, which, we could call neoliberalism. But most people just call it the economy because it's all that we've known for sort of the last 50 odd years. As soon as neoliberalism dethroned Keynesian economic management in the 1970s, the decline in inequality that I described earlier stopped and turned around, and inequality has been growing ever since. The share of economic output going to labour is now back where it was in the 1950s and still falling. This is not a fault or a side effect. This is the system working as intended. So the fact that these very dramatic economic system shifts have happened in the past and that they were brought about by, intentional planning and decision making shows us that it can happen again. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that another paradigm shift is inevitable and is beginning to happen now. However, what that replacement paradigm is yet to be determined. I think most people in Australia would say that the current economic system is not serving the country well. People know that something is wrong, but most don't really understand what the causes are or what the alternatives are. The housing crisis could be the sort of most obvious illustration. That it now takes 15 odd years of careful saving for a couple on average incomes to build up just the deposit for an average house is madness. So, here are a couple of questions to quietly contemplate for a moment. What mechanisms currently exist or currently operate in Australia that will reduce wealth inequality? What mechanisms exist that will increase wealth inequality? Important to note that I'm specifically here referring to wealth inequality, not income inequality. If any of you can think of any mechanisms currently operating in Australia that reduce wealth inequality, I'd love to hear from you. I don't know of any. So sure, there are things that slow down the increase in inequality, but none that I'm aware of that even have the potential to reverse it. By contrast, there are many active mechanisms that increase wealth inequality, from tax concessions for superannuation to, the tax treatment of capital gains. So if that's correct, then in the absence of reform, it's just a matter of time before the top 1% own all of the houses and all of the businesses. Sure, that point might be hundreds of years away, but if there are no mechanisms to reduce wealth inequality and many to increase it, then that outcome is inevitable eventually. You have a one-way street, a ratchet that just keeps cranking up inequality. So, as I said earlier, the current paradigm is full of cracks. People know it's not meeting the sort of needs of our times, and it's not delivering the kind of prosperity that people actually want. With the wealth and income that we currently have in this country, we could readily afford for nobody to live in poverty. We could afford to repair our natural environment and biodiversity. We could afford to reduce the standard work week to 4 days or 6 hours a day. And in every case, we're not doing those things because our current political economy serves profit and rent extraction first and people and planet second. This situation is not inevitable. And, you know, as I've described, economic paradigm shifts really are possible. Another important word I haven't mentioned yet is power, which is not a fifth P. Don't count that one. You know, one really encouraging thing to me about the big money and effort that goes into corporate lobbying and the capture of governments is that it's acknowledgement of where power still lies. You know, power does still lie with governments. And while governments are elected by the people, the power still lies with the people. As George Monbiot wrote in his recent book, The Invisible Doctrine, because voters demand restraints on economic power, whether that involves restricting corporate concentration or restricting environmental destruction, democracy is the problem that capital is always striving to solve. Neoliberalism is the means of solving it. Democracy is the problem that capital is always striving to solve. So, you know, while neoliberalism may be starting to crack and crumble, it's no guarantee that what will replace it will be something like a wellbeing economy. As we've seen overseas, the fascists have a ready playbook for capitalizing on the kind of political and economic disaffection that we're seeing around the world. Our efforts towards things like wellbeing economy are not so much alternatives to neoliberal business as usual, but are in fact alternatives to authoritarianism, nationalism, and militarism. If we collectively do not step into this crisis with a coherent and well-championed alternative system, then somebody else will, and we may like it even less. Thank you.